Everybody. Today's video is going to be a little bit different than what we normally put on this channel. Most of the time here, we're going to be talking about how the 18th century is represented in modern video, board, and role-playing games. And that's awesome. But what I love is when my study of 18th century literature and culture helps me understand phenomena that are still happening today. And that's very true right now. So what I want to do today is talk about endings and narrative expectations for endings and how they're created in new genres. In the 18th century, that new genre was the novel. Today, one of those new genres is the actual play live stream. So in what follows, I'm going to be talking about one of the masterpieces of the 18th century novel, Samuel Richardson's second novel, Clarissa, and how the audience reaction to that novel helps us perhaps understand audience reaction to the imminent ending of Campaign 2 of Critical Role. A few notes before we get started. 1. There will be spoilers, not for Critical Role, but for 18th century novels. But it's also important to remember, since we're talking about audience expectations and how they change over time, that spoilers as a concept didn't really exist in the 18th century. So much so that many works of 18th century fiction actually had the entire plot summary on their front page. This is not necessarily true of Clarissa. However, it is worth noting that Samuel Johnson, the famous critic and dictionary writer of the 18th century, famously said that if you read Clarissa for the plot, you'd hang yourself. You read it for the sentiment. Keep a pin in that. Second of all, it's important to remember that the 18th century novel may not be what you think it was. Yes, it was sentimental. Yes, it was often didactic. But it also included a lot of content that we would not normally expect from material from the past, unless you've read a whole bunch of it, and then you realize that there's a lot of porn. In this case, there are going to be some content warnings that are essential material to discuss the audience expectations for this ending. That includes discussions of character violence, character sexual violence, character self-harm, and character death. We'll be not discussing any of these in great detail, but it is important to know that that's the terms of the debate that will be happening in this video. So please use that information in the way that serves you best to be happy and healthy. I give a little bit of context to my 18th century colleagues for whom this may be new. Critical Role is a actual play, which means that the performers are playing a actual game, live streamed, which means it is broadcast most of the time live, pre-recorded during the pandemic, tabletop role-playing game. In other words, in this case, Dungeons and Dragons, although there are also games for systems like the new Into the Motherlands RPG, Vampire, Good Society, any number of ways that people can come together and tell stories where there's an element of chance that's usually simulated by rolling dice. In this particular case, we are talking about one of the most widely known, both in and outside of RPG circles, shows. It has a viewership of hundreds of thousands each week who watch live anywhere from 3 to 5 hours of content. Famously, this is performed with so-called nerdy-ass voice actors who are seated, well, in the before times, around a single table, now socially distanced, at least for the moment. The current controversy that I'm referring to is the debate about whether the campaign was coming to a close. And there has been heated debate for multiple months at this point about what would be required for the campaign to come to a satisfying conclusion. One of the things that I want to argue is that because actual play live streams are still in their infancy as a form, we have a lot of different debates that are taking place using different kinds of audience expectations. Some people are making arguments from mechanics. This is how D&D works. There's more levels that could be played. They could play to level 20. There are expectations that come from other media like film, television, novels, manga. There are emotional arguments about character arcs. It's a teeming hotbed, and it is fascinating to me as a scholar who started out their career writing about the endings and how endings were being transformed and formed in the cradle of the 18th century novel. So I want to talk about one particular such controversy to see if it can help us out. This is the story of Samuel Richardson, arguably one of the great cinnamon rolls of the 18th century novel. He was a printer by trade, middle class, father of many daughters, and a mentor and support to many of the authors, including many female authors, that he published. It wasn't until he was 50 that he wrote his first novel, Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded. He wanted to write a didactic novel, a novel that taught a lesson about how to be a good person in a particular rank of life. Pamela is the story, in a strange way, of workplace sexual harassment. 15, a servant newly employed by the son of her now deceased former employer, she is beset by threats of seduction at all hours of the day. Her family is too poor and too distant to be of any aid, and Mr. B, her employer, slowly kind of contracts Pamela's world. But Pamela is virtuous, and she is able to transform the heart of Mr. B, who, instead of offering her seduction, by the novel's end offers her marriage. That is the virtue being rewarded. Now, the legacies of Pamela, as many have discussed, have carried with us, right? The idea that a reformed rake makes the best husband, that you can cure someone with the power of love, and all of that bullshit has at least one origin point in the popularity of Pamela. But that wasn't the only reading of Pamela that was au courant at the time. Because Pamela is a novel written in letters, people were able to read against what Pamela is writing back to her parents and tell totally different stories, as they did in a media event that included retellings, translations, parodies, and unauthorized sequels. Richardson hated these because many of them suggested that Pamela was a whore, that she was a flirt, that she was successful in actually seducing Mr. B rather than the other way around. Richardson sits down to write his next novel, Clarissa, which will end up being the longest novel in English as well as one of the great masterpieces of the British novel. He's on the defensive. He's workshopping his material with a circle of readers that he trusts, fellow authors, some aristocratic fans, and family members. It's important to remember that Richardson sought this feedback out in many ways, often to get kind of the finer details of upper class and aristocratic life right, so that he didn't sound so middle class, which that's a wholly different video. But what he got instead was a lot of feedback about the potential ending of the novel. Clarissa is the story of a girl far more advantaged than Pamela. Clarissa has an independent inheritance from her grandparents, a family that has loved and adored and looked up to her for most of her life, a best friend who she will write to throughout the novel, as well as innumerable people who see her as a benefactress, as wise, even though she's not much older than Pamela. However, all of this begins to change when Clarissa refuses to marry the man that her family wants her to marry. And they want her to marry because she's showing a preference for a bad boy, Robert Lovelace. And the family do not want her to marry him. He is aristocratic. He has seduced many women. He is a hot mess. And it's not entirely clear from her letters how much Clarissa likes Robert. However, it's enough that her family and friends all seem to agree there's some kind of attraction there. And the novel seems to bear that out, at least to a certain extent. Clarissa is then put into an impossible situation. Her family increasingly removes her access to the outside world, is looking at her correspondence, is putting increasing threats on her. And so, feeling put into a corner, she runs away or is abducted. The novel is ambiguous. Again, epistolary novels can do that, with Lovelace. And that is where the tragedy of Clarissa begins. Lovelace first attempts to seduce Clarissa, but is unsuccessful. And he tries 4 volumes. He tries all manners of deceits. Meanwhile, Clarissa is trying to escape him through kind of deceptions or plans of her own. And she's able to briefly, but she's recaptured. She is ultimately drugged and raped. Off screen, the only acknowledgement we get in the correspondence is all is over. Clarissa lives. We have no specific details beyond that letter. That said, the question then became, by the time of the rape of Clarissa, what is to happen to Clarissa? And within the novel, different characters express different kinds of potential resolutions. Her best friend Anna hopes to recover her and live with her forever in some kind of companionate way. Her cousin, who is off in the continent, arrives too late, but had he had his way, would have successfully sued or even charged Lovelace with the rape of Clarissa. Clarissa does not want this to go to public trial. It will ruin her reputation to the extent that it is not ruined already. We get letters from innumerable people who are trying to imagine how to fix this. And we also get that in terms of the audience debate with Richardson about what the good ending is. And so it's important to remember that in this period, many audience members believed what Lady Bracknell believes in the importance of being earnest, that the good end happily and the bad unhappily, and that is what fiction means. The 18th century was so committed to the idea that good characters deserve good endings that they only staged a version of King Lear revised by Nahum Tate that had a happy ending. Instead of the tragedy of King Lear, it was the history of King Lear. Cordelia lived, married France, Lear lived, they all lived happily ever after. I don't know how that works with a history play, but that's what audiences wanted. So the question becomes, Clarissa is unquestionably good, and so how can she get a good ending? For many readers who corresponded with Richardson, whose letters as well as whole works of fan fiction survive, happiness would be marriage to Lovelace, who would have repented and reformed. And that was the ending that was being pushed by many women of Richardson's acquaintance as the good ending. Richardson didn't see that as the good ending. He did want a good ending for Clarissa, but what he believed was the good ending was that Clarissa would die. Not by her own hand, although there's debate about how Clarissa dies because she just kind of wastes away in that way that sometimes happens in 18th and 19th century fiction. But it's important to Richardson to articulate the ways in which Clarissa retakes control of her body. She successfully escapes from Lovelace to hide above an apothecary. She designs her own coffin. She writes her own will. She writes innumerable letters to be opened after her death so that she gets the last word and that she has control both of the final outcomes of her body, the final outcomes of her money, and the final way that she will be read and understood by the family and friends, many of whom have misread her for so very long in this novel. That for Richardson is the good ending. For me, these all kind of suck, right? Marrying your rapist, not great. Dying, also not great. I'm with Anna Howe. They should have run off to Wales and become, kind of the Ur ladies of Llangollen, a later real-life 18th century pair of women who lived together and threw amazing parties and hung out with all the cool literary folks of the late 18th and into the early 19th century. That's the good ending for me. But of course, I'm not an 18th century reader, and I'm not Samuel Richardson. But this is the debate that happens in this period. What the example of Clarissa shows us is the tensions between different kinds of narrative expectations. One, how do you define good? And how closely is that tied to what will later be known as a marriage plot ending, as well as who says that characters have to have a good ending if they are good? The Gothic novel is going to pick this up and run with it. Sometimes those characters will get good endings and sometimes they won't. Often there will be depictions of multiple generations of women, and only one of them ends up being what we might later call the final girl who survives. How does this help us understand the intensity of the debate about what makes for a satisfying potential ending for Campaign 2 of Critical Role? Well, as I've tried to argue in this video, part of it is that we're dealing with a new genre where the rules are not entirely codified. It's Calvin Ball, y'all. And maybe that'll continue to be true for some time to come, and we'll continue to have these kinds of debates in the discourse. Or maybe things will become more clear soon. Either way, in addition to the kind of normal audience expectation transformations with the new genre, the genre of live stream tabletop role-playing games also has one additional confounding factor. And that's one that I've talked about in my actual published work. I'm building off of the scholarship of Jennifer Grueling, who's written about narrative construction in tabletop role-playing games. She was writing before the advent of Twitch and other live streaming platforms. So she was creating a narratology, a narrative understanding of the narrative levels of when people are playing together at a table. And so there's the narrative level of what the dice are kind of impacting the gameplay. There's the narrative level of the actual character interaction. There's the narrative level of the story being told. And then she says there's this additional narrative level of the kind of talk at the table that's not related to the story being told. Think of pass the popcorn, or does anybody else need an extra drink? How was your work today? What Grueling argues in her book is that table talk is not essential to a experience of the story. So she kind of puts it to one side. What I've argued in a book that she edited this past year is that live streams add in meaning to that interpersonal narrative level because we're all watching it as audience members. What that means is that there's now the audience of the table as Grueling has constructed it, but also us as an extra audience. Matt Colville has done a really great reading of the climax of Campaign 1 of Critical Role, which I'll link to below. I will not discuss it here because spoilers. What you need to know is that Colville argues, and I agree, that it's the extra level of watching the players interact outside of the narrative discourse that provides an extra oomph of the emotional impact of what's happening in front of us. it's going to be interesting to see if the animated series gets to the end of campaign 1, how that will change for viewer experiences. But for now, knowing the meta about the interactions between players is a big part of the emotional impact of the end of campaign 1. What I've argued, thus, is that we've got a tension between not only audience expectations in a new form, but multiple audiences. There's the audience at the table, and then there's our audience. In some cases, there's a generational difference between those two audiences. There may be cultural differences. There may be a vocabulary of different genre expectations. My expectations are built on different things than many other critters. And all of our expectations are built on different expectations than those of the players at the table. And the one thing we do know in terms of the narrative contract that Critical Role has built with its viewers is that the one audience that matters for the satisfying sense of ending is the audience at the table. Now, you can debate this, and certainly people do. People have argued vociferously that the enormous success of the Kickstarter for the animated series means that the audience somehow has a stake in being satisfied by the ending of the live stream. However, as people have also argued in terms of the most recent Kickstarter for Into the Motherlands, supporting one part of a narrative, say the source book for Motherland's RPG, has very little to do with the either financial or otherwise support of other parts, like the show itself. You should back that Kickstarter. It's super cool. I endorse it. That said, this is going to continue to be a knotty debate about what audiences do and don't control. And this is where I think my age is showing. I'll be 40 in August. So when I came up in fandom, while I did hear of stories of write-in campaigns that resurrected shows from the dead, Star Trek, of course, is the example of that. Most of the stories of fanish discourse and fanish response that I grew up with had the powers that be who were far removed from us, and that it was fan art and fan fiction that provided ways of retelling stories in ways they would never be told on screen. We're in a different moment now, and there's another video or essay that I may air or write about how, for example, fan art has an intimate relationship, both professional and amateur, to the creating of the worlds of Critical Role. But that's a different video. For now, what I'm hoping that folks take away from this video is this sense that we're kind of always here, in this kind of place where if you're dealing with an exciting new genre, if you're a pioneer, you're going to be in the middle of these kinds of conflicting expectations, both as a creator of stories as well as a consumer of them. And I would encourage you, in addition to the, don't forget to love each other ethos of Critical Role, to be curious about those responses, to find them fascinating in and of themselves, and that perhaps there's not good and bad reactions. Feel your feelings, friends. But there are good and bad ways to interact with each other and with creators about those reactions. So, I hope that this has been an interesting and engaging video. And if folks are interested in more parallels between the 18th century and today, boy, howdy do me and my friends have them. We will talk about them during some of our actual play recordings and Scholar Reacts moving forward. But also, if people would like to see more videos like this, we are Critical Prof after all, so we're never super far from this content. Happy to do so. Always love to talk about all of this kind of nerdery on my Twitter, which is @Fried. And until next time, thanks for watching.